Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Jack Hagel. Republican state lawmakers are considering a bill this week that could change the way North Carolina's elections are administered. It's a nuanced bill, but here's the upshot. If it passes, it could help Republicans strengthen control over state politics for years to come. It's one of several efforts by Republicans this year to reshape how politicians are elected in the state. WRAL state government reporter Will Doran has been following all of it, and he joins us now. Will, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
The bill that's coming up for consideration this week could ultimately change who controls how elections are carried out in the state. If you could, just break down the basics of the bill. What would change?
So two big things. The power to appoint members of state and county boards would shift from the governor to the legislature. This is part of kind of a bigger trend we've seen with the legislature trying to take control of many different boards away from the governor. And then two, probably the bigger and more consequential change is it would knock the board down to having an even number of members instead of an odd number with the majority going to whichever political party controls the governor's office, which is how we've done it for over a century in North Carolina. It would be evenly split between Republicans and Democrats.
On the face of it, that seems pretty fair. You've got equal party representation. Why the consternation from the left?
So, for one, the federal Elections Commission is set up this way with an even number of members split, and it is just famously inept. They can't do anything. They can't enact any rules. They can't hold people accountable when they're found breaking the rules, and it doesn't get anything done. So critics are concerned that that same system is coming from North Carolina, that this board would just be completely toothless if you're always ending up with a complete tie along party lines on anything of consequence. And then, it's not just votes on, okay, should this person get in trouble for campaign finance violations? It's also, where should we put early voting sites? How many early voting sites should we have? Should we certify that this person who appears to have won the election actually did win the election? It's all of these questions that the boards right now are in charge of, and have an odd number of members so you never get a tie, could now start ending up in ties.
And the tiebreak itself is part of the controversy here, right?
Correct. So for some things, there wouldn't necessarily even be a tiebreak at all. And so, people are concerned for early voting, for example, that, there's not really something built into this law to have a tiebreak on. So it would just either would have to go to the courts to figure it out, or you would just have no early voting, or you would have one early voting location in county. It would just be at the county election headquarters. But, in 2020, for example, Wake County had 20 early voting sites. So, trying to cram all those hundreds of thousands of people who use that into one place, that's going to lead to just insane lines. And then two, for other things like certifying winners of elections, presidential elections, on those issues, the tiebreak could go to the state legislature. So even though it's billed as, hey, this is a bipartisan reform, really what it is, on questions of, hey, who should we give our votes in the electoral college to? It's really a question of, will this just hand that over to the Republican-led legislature to decide?
So this law would transfer ultimate power of election administration from the governor, who appoints that extra person who's currently on the boards, essentially over to the legislature.
Yes, correct.
Why do Republicans say this is needed?
They say that this is going to help with election integrity and to help improve voters' confidence that there's no funny business going on in our elections. And, on the face of it, yeah, you say, hey, you're giving the majority to whichever party already controls the governor's office. Doesn't that just kind of, incentivize one political party to bend the rules to keep themselves in power? Why not move to this bipartisan system? Well, we've already kind of gone over the critiques that some people have with, this could lead to chaos and long lines and nothing important ever actually being decided. But then what you also see is there's not really any proof that the system as it's set up has led to any shenanigans lately. Roy Cooper in 2016 won by a really narrow margin. It was, it went down to a recount. It was like 10,000 votes out of millions statewide. And that, when he won, even in that kind of dicey situation, that was under a Republican-controlled board. And then, Donald Trump won last year in 2020, again, pretty narrow margin of victory, just 1% of the vote. And he won under a Democratic-controlled board. So there are plenty of examples of, whoever holds the power on the board, that doesn't mean that their party is going to win all the elections. Our elections are administered professionally.
And it's worth reiterating that North Carolina has a Democratic governor, and the House and the Senate are controlled by the Republicans. So in theory, if this changes, sort of the deciding vote on election issues would go from Democrats to Republicans, right?
Yes, and as you noted, from the executive to the legislative branch. And that exact proposal has actually already been ruled unconstitutional pretty recently. The courts took a look at it. They said, no, the state constitution says the governor needs to be in charge of this. You can't just undo that without a constitutional amendment. We tried that in 2018. Voters shot it down with a pretty wide margin, about a 2-to-1 margin. Voters disapproved of it. So, they're trying it again. We'll see how it goes. If this does become law, it's obviously going to lead to a lawsuit, and we'll see how that ends up.
Now, lawmakers were scheduled to take up this bill last week, but they postponed that. Why the delay, and what can we expect this week?
Well, we're not entirely sure why it was delayed. We heard from GOP leadership that they needed to make some changes to it, although they didn't say what those changes were going to be. And the delay did also come at the same time that a bunch of protesters had come into Raleigh with plans to pretty vocally disrupt the voting session, show their displeasure towards the bill. There was a heightened police presence right before they made that kind of last-minute decision to postpone the vote.
Let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll hear about other efforts to change the state's elections laws. Stick around. Welcome back to the WRAL Daily Download. We're talking with WRAL state government reporter Will Doran about new laws governing elections in North Carolina. Will, earlier this session, lawmakers passed Senate Bill 747. That made changes to a whole swath of other election issues, mail-in voting, reporting on voter fraud. What's in that law, and what was the genesis of it?
So there's a lot that's in that law, and I definitely encourage people to go back and read it if they want to really get into the nitty-gritty. But the two kind of main issues are new rules for partisan poll observers and for mail-in voting. And we'll start with the poll observers. So those are folks who are appointed by political parties, and their job is to go basically hang out at your local voting precinct on election day or during early voting and just make sure that nothing untoward is happening, that, people aren't, shredding one party or another's ballots. And, it goes back to the times when, elections were a lot more rough and tumble than they are now. And so this kind of loosens the rules for them. We had reported that it came after a former Trump attorney, Cleta Mitchell, had met with Republican lawmakers. They said that her input had nothing to do with what was in the bill, despite many of her asks making it into the bill. But in general, it would kind of loosen some rules governing the behavior of those poll observers, what they can and can't do at the polling places. The other big part of it is for mail-in voting. It would make it a little harder to cast a mail-in ballot. Potentially in the future, it would start a pilot program for signature matching. So other states do match your signatures. We do not, because we require you to have a witness. If you've ever voted by mail, you'll remember that you have to either get it notarized or you have to have two different people serve as witnesses saying that, hey, this person who's voting this ballot is who they say it is. And, anyone who lies on that could be charged with felony. So that's the reason we don't have signature matching. So critics are concerned because signature matching programs in other states have led to legitimate ballots being thrown out. That's just a pilot program in this, although obviously that could become a full-fledged program in the future. The other big thing is cutting down the deadline for mail-in ballots to come in. Right now we have a 3-day grace period, and that allows people to kind of wait till the last minute to cast their ballot and, still be not necessarily guaranteed, but have peace of mind that the Postal Service can probably get it delivered within 3 days. This bill would cut it down to any ballot that hasn't been delivered by election night doesn't get counted. And that is directly inspired by Donald Trump's claims in 2020. If people remember, he went on TV on election night and declared himself the winner, even though the votes hadn't all been counted in North Carolina, in Pennsylvania, in several other key swing states. And as a lot of those votes came in and were counted, it turned out that some of those votes were for Democrat Joe Biden, who is now the president. And so Trump kind of used the fact of those late arriving ballots as, what he claimed was evidence of fraud. Obviously, courts rejected all of that. There's never any proof for it, but Republican voters, really key into what Trump says, and they have been bugging our legislators here and saying, hey, y'all have to do something about this. This is how the election was stolen from Trump. You need to fix this. And so GOP leaders feel, and they've said this, they need to act. Like, this is one of the main things that their voters are telling them that they want to see them do.
Now, there have been other major changes to elections laws this year. One of the biggest has been voter identification. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so people will remember in 2018, voters, actually at the same time that they shot down the amendment for changing up the elections board, they approved amendment for voter ID. And so that has been tied up in the courts for the last 5 years ever since then. But finally got a win at the state Supreme Court earlier this year. And actually starting this summer, the very first municipal primary elections began. There was only 2 of them, weirdly. There was one in Charlotte, one in Sanford. I went down to Sanford and hung out for the first day of early voting and talked to elections officials, voters down there, and there just were not any problems. Now, you have to understand, that the people who are showing up to vote in a, primary election for a, city council race, those are pretty dedicated voters. Those are the type of people who show up and vote for every single election. And so, they're going to be the type of people who are more likely to have their ID and everything too. But, I talked to them and they just had no issues. They were in favor of it. What critics are fearful of is, when we get to next year's presidential election and you have people who aren't as regular voters, maybe more low-income people or, folks who just aren't typical voters, those are the people who might not have IDs. And to be clear, the vast, vast majority of people have photo IDs. And this law was written to make it easy for people, even if they lack an ID, to still be able to vote anyways. There's just extra provisions that'll have to go into place to verify their identity. So it's been kind of softened from actually a 2013 law that we passed here that was much stricter and which was struck down as unconstitutional for racial discrimination.
That's right. Some critics say that even the new laws disenfranchise black voters. Do you expect there to be a continued legal battle over voter ID?
Yes, there is a continued legal battle. There's a federal lawsuit that still has not been resolved that its supporters are hoping will get resolved in their favor in time to stop it for 2024. Now, the legislature is currently, in that case, fighting to push the trial back until after the election. So, that just makes sense, right? Even if we lose, won't matter because the election will have happened already. So that's kind of the big, procedural battle happening in that lawsuit right now. But, opponents of voter ID still do, even though they have lost in state courts have said that voter ID does pass muster. There is this federal lawsuit that's still hanging out there that does have the potential to put a stop to it before next year's presidential election.
Republicans are expected to draw new voting districts this year. So when you add that to all of the elections law changes, what does that mean for the state or even the nation?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we are going to be redrawing our lines both for the state legislature and for Congress, our 14 seats in the House of Representatives. And right now in the state legislature, the reason why Republicans have been able to pass all of these laws that we've just been talking about is because they have veto-proof supermajorities. And right now they have it only by the thinnest possible margin in both chambers. They have the smallest number of votes that you need in order to override a veto from the governor. We would expect when they redraw their lines that they're going to give themselves a much bigger cushion. The state Supreme Court has newly switched from a Democratic majority to a Republican majority. The Democrats had been pretty cynical on gerrymandering. They had ruled gerrymandering unconstitutional, forced a redraw. The Republicans said, this is not an issue for the courts. The legislature gets to set the rules and basically do whatever it wants. And so they're going to have really just, whatever rules they want when they're redrawing these maps. And so, for state law, they're probably going to have a supermajority for years to come. The big question is, what does this mean for national politics? And, people who've been following the news will remember the Moore v. Harper, the independent state legislature case that the legislature here actually lost, which was about redistricting. But right now we have an even 7-7 split in our congressional delegation, even number of Democrats and Republicans. And that comes as the U.S. House is really divided by a razor-thin margin. I mean, I think it's 4-seat majority, maybe 5-seat majority that the Republicans have. It changes a bit, because people retire or die or whatever. But it's a really thin margin right now, and we have like I said, a 7-7 split. We could easily see Republicans give themselves a 10-4 or 11-3. Some people have even proposed a potential 12-2 advantage in the maps. That would be a huge swing for Republicans keeping control of the House in 2024 once those maps do go through, which we're expecting them to. Of course, other states out there are also doing redistricting, New York among them, which, I think national people, I don't cover New York politics, but what I've read about it in the national media is that they expect Democrats to kind of pick up some big gains there, maybe some other states. So it could end up being a wash, but national Republicans are certainly looking for North Carolina Republicans to do their part and cement their gains in the House.
Well, lots to keep our eyes on, and I know that you'll be reporting on the North Carolina portions of it as it happens. Will, thank you.
Always.
That's WRAL state government reporter Will Doran. For his in-depth breakdown of new election laws in the state and for all of our election coverage, visit nccapital.com. I'm Jack Hagel. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for listening to the WRAL Daily Download and for making us part of your morning routine. Another great way to get WRAL news is the Morning Briefing newsletter. It's a daily email with Triangle news, events, and headlines to help you get ready for the day. Sign up at WRAL.com/newsletter.